Hi folks, and welcome to this video on Aerosoft's new A330 Professional for Prepared. Today we're going to be taking a look at some of my initial impressions of the aeroplane. As it mentions in the title, I'm a 320 pilot in the real world, whilst the normal operating procedures of the 330 are very closely aligned with those of the 320. From the perspective of systems architecture, the two aircraft are entirely different. So whilst I've taken a cursory look through the manuals over the last week or so, I'm by no means an expert on the aircraft. In today's video, we're going to start with a look at the 3D modelling of the cockpit, as well as the texturing. Move on to a departure from 01 right here in Stockholm, during which we'll look at some of the systems modelling, including that of the engine, flight control systems, and the Autothrust. Following that, we'll start to look at the managed modes of the FMGS as we come back for the RMP procedure Zulu onto runway 1 right. That's an authorization required procedure incorporating a radius to fix leg. The details of which I'll explain a little in a little more detail later on, but suffice to say it should be an excellent test of the capabilities of the FMGC. Finally, after that, we'll execute a missed approach and talk about one of the more hotly contested points of discussion around this aircraft, the manual handling characteristics. And to test that, we'll go for a raw data ILS. Once more back onto runway 1 right with a fairly strong crosswind, just to see how controllable the aircraft is. So with that out of the way, let's head inside. So here we find ourselves in the cockpit. I've set up this view with chase plane to represent what should be the correct seating position for the 330, as described by the Flight Crew Techniques Manual. When in the ideal seating position, your eye line should have you looking out of the window, down the glare shield with your line of sight parallel with the top of the glare shield. And indeed that's how I've set things up, so you can see that the glare shield is just starting to obscure the windscreen wiper there. To confirm that you have the correct eye point, you can have a look at these index markers on the centre pillar. When the red ball nearest you obscures a white ball behind it, that's an indication that the seating position is correct. According to the FCTM, with the correct seating position, that should have you looking down the glare shield at an angle of 20 degrees, and it should put the nearest point visible outside of the window 16 metres ahead of the windscreen. So if the geometry of the cockpit is correct, it stands to reason that the cockpit windows should be 16 metres behind this point here. Conveniently enough, the spacing of the centerline lights on runways equipped for instrument approaches is 15 metres. And so as we go outside, given that a centerline light is at the very bottom of our viewpoint, the cockpit window should be directly overhead, a point just a hair behind the preceding centerline light. And going outside we can see that that is exactly the case, which would seem to suggest that Aerosoft's 3D modelling of the flight deck is spot on. Moving back inside, another lovely feature of this aircraft is the PBR texturing. The light reflects in an incredibly authentic fashion. You can see the floodlight for the centre pedestal just reflecting off this third MCDU here. It all looks very authentic indeed. And as I adjust the intensity of the light, you can see the reflection changes appropriately. That's really nice, and not something I think we've seen modelled so well in flight sim before. Something else I really like about the cockpit here is just rather simple. It's the colour of the panels. It's a very common mistake that a lot of even the very best developers make, to render the texture of the instrument panel as far too bright of a shade, whereas this is absolutely spot on. This looks just like a real Airbus flight deck. As I mentioned, we'd take a look at the systems modelling on departure. Just before we go ahead with the takeoff roll, I'd like to point out a really lovely bit of attention to detail Aerosoft have modelled with regards to the FADEC. The Trent 700 engine features a means of protection against fan blade vibration by limiting the EPR range, or limiting the EPR from stabilising in the range of 1.16 to 1.28. And so when I set a thrust lever angle corresponding to that EPR, which is visible on the engine warning display here by this little blue donut, the EPR will be maintained outside of that range, as I say, to prevent fan blade fluttering. Setting an EPR of 1.2 here, we can see that the engines in fact stabilise at 1.16. Advancing the thrust levers further, they then accelerate beyond the range to 1.28. As I move the commanded EPR beyond 1.28, behaviour once more becomes conventional. Another feature of the FADEC, and this applies to all engine variants of the 330, is something called the Modified Engine Acceleration Schedule for takeoff. This is to help mitigate against the threat of a compressor stall, and it simply allows the engines to accelerate at a reduced rate. As a result of this, they'll take nearly 10 seconds to accelerate from the stabilised thrust, in the case of these Trent 700's 1.15 EPR, to takeoff thrust, which with today's flex takeoff is going to be 1.6 EPR, just a little less than that. We can observe that on the takeoff run itself. Regarding the takeoff here, it's going to be a flex departure from runway 1 right. Noise abatement departure procedure 2 is favoured here at Stockholm. That's the exact definition of what that is probably a little beyond the scope of this video, but suffice to say that thrust reduction and acceleration altitude will be coincident at 1,000 feet above aerodrome elevation. That's 1,140 feet on the QNH. We'll now set trim for takeoff here, 0.8 units up. And other than that, I believe I've completed cockpit configuration for takeoff. Just a quick briefing of what will happen on the takeoff roll though. The takeoff technique is almost identical to that of the 320. So we begin by stabilising the engines at an intermediate thrust setting to prevent any thrust asymmetry due to different spool-up times caused by variations between the two engines. So in that case that's 1.15 EPR. We'll set a light forward pressure on the side stick, which will maintain until 80 knots, slowly neutralising the stick by 100 knots. Passing the rotation speed, will, at least according to the FCTM, pull about 2/3 back pressure on the side stick, which should give us a rotation rate of between 2 and 3 degrees per second, and initially we'll pitch for an attitude of 15 degrees. After that we'll follow the flight director guidance, the speed reference system, the vertical mode after takeoff is known as, and that will have us pitching for a speed of V2 plus 10 knots, today 146 knots. Our takeoff weight today is 177 tons, that is, at least according to the FCOM I have access to for the 330, the maximum landing weight. It is a rather out-of-date FCOM, it's for aircraft manufacturer serial number 54, which this is a rather more recent aircraft. Airbus have made several incremental developments throughout the lifespan of the 330. When it debuted in 1994, maximum takeoff weight was 212 tons. This was then increased in 1999 up to 230 tons, and that incremental development stage also saw the incorporation of FMS2. In 2003 it was increased again, as we see in this aircraft, to 233 tons, and that update also saw EIS2, Electronic Instrumentation System 2, which saw the introduction of the LCD displays replacing the CRTs, as well as the integrated standby instruments replacing the previous electromechanical setup. Finally, with that update, the previously conventional rudder was replaced with a fly-by-wire system. In 2012, the max takeoff weight was increased again to 235 tons, and in 2015 Airbus made available the high gross weight version of the aircraft, which increased the maximum takeoff weight a further 7 tons up to 242 tons, and increased the fuel capacity by about 33 tons when a centre tank was integrated into the 300 series aircraft, similar to that in the 200 series. If you want any more details on the incremental development of the 330, I've linked in the description an excellent edition of Airbus's Fast magazine, which covers the subject in some detail. So, with the actions as discussed, let's go. Brakes released. Takeoff. Light forward pressure. Stabilising the engine thrust at 1.15 EPR. Rather strong crosswind today, 18 knots right across from the right as the engine stabilised. Manflex SRS runway. And just as should be the case, the engines are rather slow to accelerate. You see I'm having to use a lot of rudder to keep the centre line here. Not using any lateral aileron. Airbus generally advise against that, as the increased weight on the windward wheels can increase the aircraft's propensity to weathercock. And that's positive climb, gear up. Nav. And so the takeoff generally felt pretty good there. I'll just pop the autopilot in here. AP1. And as we pass 1140 feet, we go thrust climb, open climb, heading. Ordinarily we'd accelerate and clean up here, but for the next demonstration I'm just going to hold a selected speed of 170 knots. Regarding my thoughts on the handling of the aircraft on departure there, as I said, the FCTM suggests about 2/3 backstick is what's necessary to achieve the desired rate of rotation. That seemed to be about what I applied, and it looked about correct. My only criticism of it would be that during the takeoff roll, the ground mode of normal law is active, during which the pitch control is totally conventional, with elevator deflection being proportional to side stick deflection. After liftoff and with an attitude above 8 degrees nose up, the flight control laws change over to the flight mode over the course of 5 seconds. So that's, in the real 320 at least, a very smooth transition, and in this Aerosoft 330 it all felt rather abrupt to me. You notice that the rate of pitch up increased a fair bit, passing sort of about 12 or 13 degrees as flight mode came in. Exactly what flight mode is, I'll come to later in the video when we discuss the handling of the aircraft in more detail. Speed L Cruise Star. So as I mentioned, the next demonstration will centre around the flight controls and the autothrust. One little anomaly I've noticed in the aircraft here is when the selected speed with the autothrust exceeds is greater than Vmax or less than VLS, Vmax being the red barber's pole here. That's the lowest of the flap limiting speed, gear limiting speed, maximum Mach operating or maximum velocity operating, or VLS, which is velocity lowest selectable. When the speed target is set outside of that range, the autothrust will command a speed, or will command the limiting speed, either Vmax or VLS. We'll notice here, as I select a speed above Vmax, that the autothrust will in fact accelerate the aircraft beyond that speed. And I will demonstrate that in a second, but just before I do so, the next thing we're going to talk about is the flap load relief system. This is a common feature in wide-body aircraft, but not something present on the 320. So with flap 2 selected here, when we exceed VFE flap 2 by more than 2.5 knots, so VFE flap 2 is 196 knots, if the speed therefore exceeds just over 198 knots, we will automatically be changed to a configuration called config 2 star, where the flaps automatically retract from 14 degrees to 10 degrees. So let's demonstrate that now. I'm going to select a speed of 200 knots here. The correct behaviour should be that the aircraft in fact maintains Vmax of 196 knots, but as I've mentioned, it's not going to do that. Two more minor anomalies here. The overspeed warning should not sound until we're at least 4 knots into the 4 knots beyond Vmax. As you saw there, the aircraft sounded the overspeed warning as soon as we exceeded Vmax. And additionally, I was able to cancel the overspeed warning with the master caution the master warning push button here, which again is not accurate. To cancel an overspeed warning, you should need to use the emergency cancel push button. Neither of these are a big deal at all, but they will each be nice things to see fixed. However, what I am pleased to say is that the auto flap retract has behaved perfectly as we exceeded 198 knots there. The flaps automatically retracted to 10 degrees, and we have a flap relief message flashing green here. The only other small anomaly is that there is a published flap limiting speed for config 2 star, that's 205 knots, and when the aircraft is in config 2 star, Vmax should be indicated as such, 205 knots, but it's remained at the config 2 flap limiting speed. Bringing the speed back below Vmax now. Once we get 2.5 knots below Vmax, so just under 194 knots, the flap should extend once again to config 2. And there we go, perfect. So we're above F speed, we'll go to config 1 plus F now. In config 1 plus F, the flap limiting speed is 215 knots. We'll now demonstrate a system which is also present on the 320. It's only very subtly different, more in terms of indications than practical effect, and that's the auto flap retract. So when I accelerate beyond 200 knots, we'll get an auto flap retract, the slats will remain extended, and we'll go from 1 plus F to config 1. And just so we don't get too far away here, I'm going to start turning the aircraft toward the initial approach fix here. And there we go, exactly as it should behave. And in this case, Vmax has adjusted itself correctly up to 240 knots. All very nice to see indeed. Now I'm going to clean up entirely and accelerate the aircraft to 230 knots. Flap 0. On the whole then, the systems modelling for this aircraft is very nice, and Aerosoft did explicitly say that in the first couple of weeks they would consider this aircraft almost to be early access, given I've only had it, given it's only been 3 days since release. These are very minor issues. I just thought they'd be worth pointing out, perhaps if anyone in the development team is watching. As I said, for the next part of the video, we're going to take a look at the RMP approach onto runway 01 right, the authorization required approach. Just before we get to that though, we'll have a quick chat about the characteristic and limiting the characteristic and protection speeds of the A330. As I mentioned on the ground, the normal procedures are almost identical between the 330 and the 320. but underneath they're very, very different aircraft indeed. And a great example of this is the architecture of the flight control system. On the 320 it's one of the flight control computers, the flight augmentation computer, which is entirely responsible for the characteristic and protection speeds. Meanwhile, the characteristic speeds here on the 330 are provided by a sub-part of the flight management guidance system, the flight envelope function. The protection speeds then do come from one of the flight control computers, the flight control primary computer, or PRIM. Practically speaking though, the system works identically. I'm going to activate the approach now. It's nice to see that the characteristic speeds are indeed being calculated accurately. Our gross weight here is 175 tons. I did reference the FCOM earlier, and according to it, VS1G for sorry, give me a second here. Yes, no, I'll come to that later actually. In the way of the characteristic speeds, in the 330, green dot speed is equal to 0.6 times the aircraft gross weight plus 107 knots. So 0.6 times 175 there should be 105, plus 107 gives us 212, and that's exactly what green dot speed's indicated as. And that's a very good start. We'll have a look at some of the other characteristic speeds as we go along, but just a quick briefing for what to expect on the approach here. The initial approach fix is this point here, rainy. That's to be at or above an altitude of 4,000 feet. Then the intermediate fix here, Sierra Alpha 575 down to 2,500 feet, and the final fix, Sierra Alpha 571, 2,300 feet is the platform altitude, and that takes us straight down a 3-degree glide path around this radius to fix leg here. A radius to fix leg is, as the name suggests, a leg defined by a constant radius to another point in space, and so to fly that leg with varying speeds and a stiff crosswind like this, the aircraft is going to have to modulate the bank angle to fly the leg accurately. So that will be a very good test of just how good the Aerosoft's FMGS is. With that in mind, and this being quite a slippery beast, we're going to set the platform altitude now and engage the descent mode. If it's going to behave as per the real aeroplane, what we should notice is that whilst 2,300 feet is blue for now, as soon as we engage the descent mode, the altitude constraint at Ramey should become the altitude target, so let's do that. And indeed, descent alt magenta, 4,000 feet magenta, so it is going to abide by the constraints there, which is very good to see. As I say, it is a slippery aircraft, so I'm going to start configuring now, get flaps 1 out there. For the rest of the approach setup, we haven't tuned any nav radios. The required navigation performance for the approach is 0.3. That would adjust automatically passing the final approach fix, but as a belt and braces check, I'm just going to enter it now to ensure accurate monitoring of the navigation accuracy. We're also indicating GPS primary, which is required for this approach. It's a GNSS required procedure. Those are the met conditions. As you can see, more or less straight from the right, we have 18 knots of crosswind. That will vary slightly in the upper levels here. And the minimum, the 330 is certified as an approach category Charlie aircraft on the basis of its reference approach speed in the landing configuration. though some operators do fly it as a Category Delta. I've chosen to enter the Cat Charlie minima, 510 feet. It's going to be a config full approach. Finally, in the secondary flight plan, I have the ILS approach ready for later. And passing the initial approach fix Ramey here, we should notice the altitude constraint moves down to 2,500 feet. Another little point of note just about the flaps here, in config 1 on the approach, VFE next for config 2 should be indicated as 205 knots for config 2 star. The reason for this is the 330 exhibits a pretty enormous range of potential gross weights, and at high gross weights S speed will be greater than VFE next config 2. Or VFE config 2 rather. So to ensure that you're able to extend flaps under all conditions throughout the complete range of gross weights, it's perfectly acceptable if S speed is sufficiently high to extend directly into config 2 star. Now, as I said, this is a slippery aircraft, and with that tight radius turn I want to fly this stabilised approach, so I'm going to extend the gear now. As the gear comes down, we'll arm the ground spoilers, check the lights are all set for landing, which they are. And when the gear indicates down with 3 greens, we'll come to flap 3. And when the final fix, Sierra Alpha 571, becomes the 2 waypoint, we'll arm the approach. I did mention earlier we were going to talk a little about the characteristic speeds of the aircraft. This is another little anomaly I've spotted. Arming the approach now, so that's approach now, final blue. Looking at the FCOM VS1G for config full at 175 tons, should be 108 knots, VS1G being the 1G stall speed. According to the books, VLS should be 1.23 times the 1G stall speed, so that's 133 knots. You can see that accurately reflected in the MCDU there, but VLS on the PFD here doesn't actually line up with that, so perhaps another little thing to be adjusted. And here we come, passing the final approach fix. We have Altstar final approach, and see at the start of this radius to fix leg, we've got about 15-16 degrees of bank on. I'm going to come back to flaps full now. But as we proceed through the turn, and we come from a sort of quartering tailwind into a direct tailwind, the bank angle slowly reducing. And it really does appear that the aircraft's doing a superb job of following this radius to fix leg. Very impressive to see. Really suggests Aerosoft have modelled the managed modes of the FMGS very nicely indeed. Now I am expecting to break visual on this approach, but nevertheless, for the sake of moving on to the raw data ILS, we are going to go around off this approach. So the go around actions in the 330 exactly the same as those of the 320. We'll call go around flaps, advance the thrust levers through to toga, call the FMA and monitor the performance of the autopilot, so that will be man toga, SRS, nav, watch the autopilot pitch up towards around 15 degrees, and as soon as I push the thrust levers through, the pilot monitoring would select one stage of flap up, so that would be flap 3 here.
1000.
The only integrity check on this approach is overhead this, Sierra Alpha 638, 920 feet, and passing overhead, that's exactly where we are. The autopilot flying the aircraft every bit as accurately as I'd expect. All very nice to see indeed. Once we have a positive climb in the go-around there, I'll select the gear up, and it's a rather low platform altitude off the go-around here at 1,500 feet.
500.
And there are the lights.
100 above.
There is a 1 degree offset
400.
between the final approach course and the runway here, so this little offset looks
Minimum.
accurate, the vertical profile looks excellent.
300.
All great to see. With that, we'll go around. Go around
Minimum.
flaps.
Minimum. 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 Minimum.
Positive climb. Gear up. Mantoga SRS nav. Alt star. Speed. Passing F speed, flaps 1. And the aircraft now accelerating toward green dot speed, 212 knots, exactly as it should be. Passing S speed, flap 0. And we disarm the spoilers. The aircraft following go-around track, which is passing minimum altitude 600 feet or 1 DME after Alpha Sierra Echo. Turn right to track 039 degrees, and that's just what it's doing. Very nice to see. So with all of that done, we're now going to turn towards a downwind leg with that wind out of the east there, just put about 10 or 15 degrees of drift on, and round to 170 degrees, set us up for the ILS back in. On the whole then, I'd say the FMGS handled all of that absolutely perfectly. The autopilot flew the aircraft smoothly, accurately, precisely, exactly what you'd expect of the real aeroplane. There's, in a way, very little to say about it besides just how impressive it is. Now coming back for the ILS, as I mentioned, I've got that set up in the secondary flight plan here, so I'm just going to activate that. And I've already put in the minimum for the missed approach, for the ILS there, 340 feet. As a basic idea of what we're doing here, it's going to be a 12-mile final from a platform altitude of 4,000 feet, which we'll climb up to now. Now concerning the handling of the aeroplane, the flight mode of normal law I alluded to earlier is what is known as a modified C-star algorithm. What that means is that ostensibly forward and aft side stick deflection commands a load factor, though at lower speeds pitch rate is also taken into account. If it were to command purely load factor, the pitch rate at low speeds would be excessive for a given input. The result of this is that theoretically, in the flight mode of normal law, every contemporary Airbus should handle identically. And whilst I can imagine that there may be subtle differences between a 330 and a 320, I would think my experience would be broadly representative of the expected sort of handling behaviour of the aeroplane. So with that said, as we level off here, I'll turn off the autopilot, autothrust and flight directors and get ready for the approach. Alt star. Just before I do that though, another nice thing to see is that in the 330, the approach is calculated relative to VLS. it's limited to between VLS plus 5 and VLS plus 15, and it's equal to VLS plus 1/3 of the headwind component reported on the ground. So if, for example, the wind were down the runway 010 degrees at 30 knots, for example, we'd expect the approach to increase from 138 knots to 143, and so it does, so that's very nice to see. Another really important feature of the Airbus approach speed management, though, is ground speed mini. What this does is mitigate against the threat of wind shear, particularly the case of the microburst, by ensuring the total energy state of the aircraft remains above a sort of sensible threshold of what might be expected later in the approach. And so to achieve this, the ground speed is limited to a minimum of the V-approach minus the reported headwind component. So in this case, if hypothetically the winds were down the strip at 30 knots, the ground speed during the approach would be limited to a minimum of 113 knots, with the target speed bug increasing the commanded speed as needed to maintain that ground speed. Therefore, if I lie to the FMGS about what winds we're expecting on approach, for example, if I tell it we're expecting a 10-knot tailwind, we would expect the minimum ground speed the aircraft would permit would be 148 knots, because it'd be taking into account a 10-knot tailwind. Now, I've noticed previously that the ground speed mini function doesn't appear to be implemented, so having lied to it on the wind, I'm going to want to see the magenta speed bug on approach not at 138 knots, but 148 knots, and I don't believe it's actually going to do that. We will wait and see, though. So I'm just going to bug an intercept heading here. In fact, I'll put it all the way round to runway heading and just disconnect in the turn here. So, Autothrust off, autopilot off, flight directors off. I'm going to start configuring now. Thrust idle, flaps 1. Just before the aircraft sinks any further. Again, that's not entirely accurate. The aircraft should be stable with respect to trajectory, so when I close the thrust levers there, even though a conventional aircraft would start a descent, the Airbus should have maintained its level flight path angle there. On the whole, though, I think the general criticism of the handling of the aircraft, that it's sort of too numb, is not necessarily fair. This feels, broadly speaking, very much like an Airbus should to me. With that tailwind, we're just going slightly through the localizer here, but it looks like we may temporarily become established, but nothing too... oh no, we remained established there, so that's good. But broadly speaking, this all feels very good to me. I have got the patched flight dynamics provided by Mathis on the Aerosoft forum about a day and a half after launch installed here, which I think initially when the aircraft was launched it did all feel a little bit numb and heavy, but with this patch installed I think this feels very representative indeed. With the glide slope coming in there, we're going to go flap 2. Unlike a 320, you won't be able to maintain a 3-degree glide path with just the slats out in a 330. It's the drag profile is simply too low, and I really ought to have my LS push button turned on. That's quite an oversight on my part. But this all feels very good to me. It's certainly very straightforward to maintain the aircraft on the correct flight path with the ILS here. It all feels very smooth and stable. But as discussed earlier, we can see that ground speed Mini is not behaving correctly, and in fact the V approach is being commanded at 138 rather than 148 knots. You can see that that tailwind component I mentioned hasn't actually materialised. So that's a little bit of a shame. I would say, given the sort of design goal of this aircraft is to, or this add-on is to represent the day-to-day operations of the aircraft, it would be nice to see something like ground speed Mini, which is very noticeable in the day-to-day operation of an Airbus aircraft, faithfully recreated. Again, not a big deal though, and I think all of the important things have been modelled
2,500.
and indeed some of the finer details, like the FADEC behaviour I demonstrated on the ground. Passing 7 miles there, it's very early to drop the gear, but I just want to stabilise the aircraft early, given I'm a little unfamiliar with it. But a more typical time to drop the gear would be sort of between 5 and 6 miles. The only glide integrity check on this approach is at 5.5 miles, and that's 1,890 feet. Gear down, flaps 3. And 5.5, 1,890 feet, the glide slope integrity checks. Again, between flap settings here, I'm having to manually compensate for the change in configuration, which should be done automatically. I'm having to pitch the aircraft down to maintain the flight path, which in at least the real 320, it's very pronounced the way the aircraft corrects itself between configuration changes. It's not something that you have to do manually, and it's something you can absolutely feel the aircraft doing. But either the Aerosoft flight model is not being authoritative enough in how it does that, or it's just not doing it at all. But that would be another nice thing to see improved.
One thousand.
Now, as for the landing technique of the 330, it's broadly very similar to that of the 320. The principal difference being the suggested flare height is increased from 30 to 40 feet, though of course that varies on an approach-to-approach basis. And just like the 320,
500.
it's suggested that you close the thrust levers, I quote, when best adapted, which
100 above.
just sort of means at a sensible time.
400.
With the crosswind here, I'm going to make sure the aircraft remains upwind of the centerline as I eliminate
Minimum.
the drift with the rudder, otherwise we'll end
300.
up downwind of the centerline, and possibly just apply a little bit of interwind aileron just to stop the drift. And you can see breaking out of the cloud
200.
here quite nicely on profile. Just keeping that aiming point where it is, getting a little low there. Slightly
100.
transition to visual, but nothing too terrible.
50, 40, 30, 20. Retard. 5.
I think possibly the aircraft was starting to drift downwind more aggressively than one might expect there. I had to put in quite a lot of interwind aileron to keep it on the centre line, but overall not too bad at all. Manual brakes. So with that said, let's cut to the replay, and I'll summarise my thoughts on the aircraft. So to conclude, I've been extremely impressed with the Aerosoft 330. There's lots of lovely, very intricate attention to detail. The important elements of the system modelling are all there. The aircraft has lots of really lovely attention to details, particularly stuff like the FADEC handling, low speed, with regards to the characteristic speeds being broadly almost entirely accurate. The calculation of the approach very nice. Most of all, I think what impresses me is how well the FMGS is able to handle just about the most complex navigational problem it can be presented with, radius to fixed leg, during an RNP authorization required approach. I think there are probably very few add-ons in the flight sim world capable of that. Similarly, I think the handling of the aircraft is perfectly acceptable. It feels broadly like an Airbus should to me. Though, as I mentioned, there are one or two things that it would be nice to see improved with respect to aircraft handling, particularly how the aircraft remains stable with regards to trajectory throughout configuration changes and throughout transition between the various flight modes of normal law. I also think the aircraft is very reasonably priced. It certainly undercuts a lot of the other high-end add-ons in the marketplace by, 30 plus euros in many cases, and I really don't feel it's lacking in any meaningful ways. Therefore, I can wholeheartedly recommend anyone go out and get this aircraft. I think you'll have a lot of fun with it. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. No doubt I've made some mistakes, so please, I'm sure I don't need to ask, but tell me about them in the comments below. And if there's anything else you'd like me to show about this aircraft, or anything else in Flight Sim, indeed share any other real-world experiences I might have had, just comment below. I'd be delighted. Thanks again for watching.